del medio ambiente y darles la bienvenida a esta ruta hacia la COP28, una serie de diálogos en torno a temas de adaptación, mitigación, transparencia de acción climática y finanzas climáticas para llegar con una voz unida hacia la próxima COP28. También todas las conclusiones que tengamos servir como insumo para el foro de ministros del medio ambiente a finales de año. Sin más preámbulos, me gustaría presentar eso. Y pues nada, Piedad, el inicio, por favor.
Thank you very much, Emil. It's a real pleasure to have you all here to welcome to the first event of the route towards COP28 Latin American Caribbean with a really important topic as financing for adaptation. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to be able to witness live at this important discussion. And I would like to thank especially the joining of the secretaries of the Convention for Climate Change. As you know, that we have a lot of expectations on COP28 and behind a lot of efforts from the international community to be able to move forward in the definition of essential and key matters this year. We expect, among others, to complete the framework of the global adaptation framework to finish the first global inventory of global stockpile of the Paris Agreement and Paris Convention, and to move forward with the definition of mechanisms of financing for losses and damages. Also, the committee of transition that was established in COP27 for the achievement of losses and damages is based on the information on how the fund being operated and COP28. And Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the UN, launched a plan in COP27 to make sure that the whole worldwide population is covered by early alert system of multi-risk in the upcoming 5 years. So in 2023, this year, we are prioritizing three things: identifying the gaps in analyzing the capacities of people to handle early alert systems, to move forward with implementation, and to increase financing. It's a really interesting year, and we hope that we can move forward quite a lot. In parallel with international negotiations and the programs of UN for climate, we always promote climate action at all scales, from global to local, in all scopes of the Paris Agreement. In the dialogues towards COP28, want us to to promote action among the different stakeholders to strengthen its action diversity, but being strong to be heard, to be built under the influence of demands that are similar in critical needs and based on scientific evidence that each year it's stronger and gets stronger. The need has a really important or specific focus in Latin American Caribbean because it's one of the most affected regions from climate change due to its geographic location, but also to its social, financial fragility and the importance that it has environmentally and worldwide. It's a priority topic for the region, and a couple of pieces of data that are really specific, that are meteorological institution and the IPCC report tells us is that 175 disasters were registered between 2020 and 2022, and 88% have relation with climate. And these events represent 40% of the associated deaths to disasters and 71% of the financial losses. The levels of the ocean keep increasing and going faster worldwide, and they're deploying even coastal communities here in Panama, for example. The glaciers of the tropical Andes have lost 30% of their surface since the 80s, and that has increased and generated already as water scarcity issue. The northeast of Brazil and the Central America countries are the countries in the areas of most sensitivity to slides. So under this scenario, we need to proceed under climate justice and resiliency in the long term. We require a regional stronger focus with more investment and more international cooperation. That's why the Office of the NUMA for Latin American Caribbean work to identify losses and damages and encourage adaptation, especially with solutions based in nature and with planning of development. And it helps the countries of region to identify their strategies of adaptation, the national plans of adaptation, to strengthen structures of interinstitutional coordination, but also among different actors, to design financial mechanisms that are innovative, to identify those priorities that need financing. Additionally to this programmatic adaptation, PNUMA believes that the adaptation is important to have an impact and a cascade effect towards the event. So in this first event of the Route Towards COP20, we have gathered a group of exceptional stakeholders, and they will be a real pleasure to dialogue around these issues, the ambitions, and the reality of the global goal for adaptation. Dialogue is going to help us to identify national identity realities and to identify positions and the hot topics among stakeholders and to promote the participation of different stakeholders like government, civil society, private sector to contribute towards a framework that will increase financing and that will increase the matter of adaptation that's so delayed. The conclusions that we can get off of here are going to be feeding off the prepping work for the ministries in meeting in the Forum of Ministries of Environment of Latin America and Caribbean, which will take place before COP28, and also the work that the UN is doing supporting countries. To finish off, I would like to recognize my colleagues and work from Bluma Argentina 1.5 and the Global Network for Adaptation to this session. With any further ado, I let's welcome the next part of this webinar, and let me wish you all the success in the world.
Alan,
So,
muchas gracias. Y ya que mencionamos que teníamos
now that you mentioned that we have this important roster as you invite,
de los centros
let
regionales de
me welcome
adaptación,
Eloana, which she is an important member of the Commission for Climate Change.
el piso es tuyo.
Please, Andrea Camponera, the floor is yours.
Buenos días.
Thank you. Good morning, distinguished participants for the workshop
Realidad de la meta
for the
global.
ambition and the reality
Es un
of
placer estar aquí hoy en el primer seminario
the
virtual.
global goal adaptation. It's important for me to talk about the Latin
Todo
American
me gustaría saludar a los colegas del
First of all, I would like to welcome and thank our colleagues from UNEP for the promoting this type of event for Latin American Caribbean, also to Martin, the director of the office here in Panama. My name is Andrea Campocara. I'm the global coordinator for the regional system for collaboration of the Convention on Climate Change, and it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome you here in behalf of our organization.
Centros regionales de
The Regional
colaboración,
Center for Collaboration for the RCTs are a network of offices from the Climate Convention located in different regions of the world: Africa, Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, Pacific, and in the newest in the North of Africa and the Middle East.
de América Latina.
Specifically in Latin America's and Caribbean case, we have two centers, one in Panama and one in Grenada in Georgia.
Los centros tienen el fin de
Centers have the means or the focus of supporting governments,
ambientales,
non-governmental organizations, investors, and private investors in Central America to the contribution of the different goals. And what that means, we provide technical assistance and practical assistance in adaptation, mitigation, transparency, implementation means in collaboration among all the stakeholders. Adaptation is so important in the work of our collaboration centers. Centers are active to report about the intergovernmental process of the needs of adaptation, the barriers, and the success stories in the region of Latin American Caribbean. That's a key information for our colleague in Bonn that support negotiations towards adaptation and the implementation of the work program of has machines for the adaptation goal. In this context, we can imagine how important of events such as today's are for us. It's an honor to hear from panelists and experts discuss among elements and conditions that should be a part of the global goal on adaptations framework and visualize the needs of the region in matters of adaptation and getting to know their needs and challenges. Let me invite you in this space of today to share your experiences and support needs. And let me encourage you to also use RCC and all the experts for any doubt that you might have. And just to finish off, I would like to say one more time, welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. Thank you for the opportunity to UNEP, and thank you for having me again.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Y
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure for us to have this important browser invitees. Fabiola Rodriguez has over 12 years of experience in the Secretariat of the Framework Convention for Climate Change.
hablar sobre el
So
programa
he
de
will let us know about the global
pues Fabiana,
global
hablemos
adaptation goals
puntualmente con ese estudio.
specifically this year. So please go ahead, Fabiana. The floor is yours.
Fabiana, creo que tienes en mute.
Fabiana, muted.
Computador, puedes
And
abrir el micrófono.
you can open the mic then.
Lo debes activar desde tu equipo.
You need to open your mic from your own device. It doesn't work.
Vale, Fabiana, no hay ninguna dificultad.
No
Entonces,
problem, Fabiana.
vamos
While
a
we
los
fix
problemas
this
técnicos que
technical
tenemos
problem
con
that we have,
Fabiana, vamos a seguir
Fabiana,
con la agenda.
we'll carry on with our agenda.
Es
So
Pilar
our next
Bueno.
guest is Pilar Bueno.
Pilar Buenos fue
Pilar
copresidenta
Bueno was a co-chair of the Adaptation Committee, also of the Framework Commission for the UNFCCC. And right now is the leader of Argentina 1.5. So Pilar, I would like to please go ahead with your floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I
Muchísimas
hope that
gracias.
you can
En
hear me,
primer
see
lugar,
me
quisiera
well. First of
agradecer
all, I would like to thank
al Programa de Naciones
the
Unidas
United
para el Medio
Nations Program
Ambiente
for
esta
Climate
colaboración
Change for
con
Environment, in this case in the collaboration with Argentina 1.5,
mundo.
whom I'm representing
Todos mis comentarios
today,
disculpen,
and all my comments are going to be in sync with our own group's work.
agradecer a todos
At
los
the same time, I would like to thank all of the speakers
muy rápidos que dieron a
that
la
we were really
invitación.
quickly jumped on the invitation that we've sent out. And thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Y en ese sentido,
And
bueno, me
in that
gustaría
sense, I would like to share now.
bien. Un momento.
So 1 second.
¿Me podés indicar, Daniel, si ya se ve
Can
mi
you
pantalla?
tell me, Daniel, if you can see my screen?
Sí, Pilar, se ve perfecto. Muchas
Yes,
gracias.
Pilar, we
Muchas
can see it.
gracias. Bien, entonces, simplemente recopilando el año
Okay, so
pasado,
summarizing up, last year in
Egipto,
COP27 in Egypt,
tuvimos un
we had
interesante
an
resultado
interesting
que
result
a distancia de los
that,
países de la región de América Latina y
differently
el
from
Caribe,
our Latin American and Caribbean regions,
de dos
they
negociación,
were two groups of
justamente
negotiation
en el
together.
marco de la
This
meta global de
framework of
adaptación,
the global goal on adaptation, now that we can see this decision that's
en ese
been made,
sentido, de marco
we need to remember that in that sense that this framework summarizes a group of conditions that are key, the stakeholder policies for adaptation, topics that are also linked to the IPCC in its most recent report, horizontal reports, and the agreed upon sources that have to do with the world or the global balance. Under that sense, we adopted this decision and a structured focus for a complete vision through COP28, and that's what this whole conversation is about today. In its process of adoption, we have supporting missions that are important throughout this discussion, and logically, retrospectively, and prospectively to think about what are we at in the review of our goal, which is one of the four components of our global goal that we're going to see in a little while, but also to comply moving forward for this goal to actually be reached at that point. In our group, we have always expressed that this is our point of view. This is a vision of the process as the convention understands it. This is the image of the process itself of the convention that shows what are all these stages for the policy cycle and how we understand that starting this point of the policy cycle, we generate a proposal that would allow us towards the end of the year to adopt a framework according to the characteristics of the region. And that's why throughout different points of my presentation, I will make comments regarding that. Some of the pending topics, which are not a few, are many, because of timing for today, I'm talk about the world, why the global balance, the metrics and objective indicators, and about financing that, as I say, the main elements that we still have to solve according to this framework to understand what's missing, looking forward the COP28 process, understanding that the process of program of work for the global goal adaptation that's already been going on since last year is going through its fifth workshop. and we still are missing three more. And if it's true, this is not a process of negotiation. The technical supplies that are offered here are complementary throughout the process of negotiation for this year as well, in the subsidiaries and at the COP itself. So in that sense, the global balance tells us already regarding adaptation what are those four components, and one of them is specifically the testing or um, for the process of the achievement of the goal. And there we have a current challenge that has to do with the timeline that so far we have not made. We have not made a review of the process developed because the framework is still not adopted. So we have different options here that have to do with generating a clear guideline. And right now in the subsidiaries meeting in June, alongside in negotiation encounters and the worldwide global balance will open space for some sort of document and decree maybe for the secretariat to be able to issue a document that we don't have yet because in the global balance we have a group, a cluster of submissions and documents that have also been made by the co-facilitators of the process. But we have many elements that are still or still represent gaps, especially the links between these elements. How is this going to be carried out to the final legal framework of the annex, if it's annexed, if it's a chairmanship decision, or if it has a direct impact in each and one of the individual components. And that's why also we have an analysis of the whole process and how the process interlinks itself. For example, the implementation of the communications for adaptation in regards of the global goal or the recognition of efforts of the countries in development and among others. So in that sense, regarding the metrics or objectives and indicators, we identify that at least we have three approaches that we can back ourselves up from. One of them has to do with a point of view or bottom up, meaning governments needing to generate, actually already doing it, indicator systems, monitoring systems, assessment, and own learning, self-learning, and how all of these will be focused in a more bottom to top point of view. We have a mixed approach. That's what we are proposing. That exclusively uses a bottom-up analysis of indicators globally. That would be like an Sendai or ODS style. That way, what you have on screen is an approach to understand how a mixed approach can allow us to interlink directly with the ambition cycles, national and collective, and maybe generate an additional guideline or an additional type of material, just as CGEVE already made regarding the component of adaptation for VML components, and that has to do or how can we interlink this new material with the goal itself. And in that sense, we already have a bunch of elements that will allow us to work on this. It's more a task of gathering all of the MPG's decision from the 18 MCA ones decision. We have monitoring systems. We have the different systems of monitoring for political elements. So different elements that can merge onto some sort of additional explanatory type of document where governments are using the framework to be able to generate their next year's report. Those that decide voluntarily, of course, to present the adaptation component, to have an international aggregational process with data record collection that can serve as a guide that maybe the committee for adaptation can put together, but at the same time generating certain global goals related to process as for results. I don't want to leave without saying that we advise and it's possible to keep on strengthening the framework with some components. These things are the only two clear examples that have to do with the clear identification of what we already have in the last year's adapted framework and the system and communications report to avoid double work. That way you can see DBR, DTA, the apps which are the communication and reporting instruments. And at the same time, we can place some of the elements like the enabling conditions to be governance, data and information, pointers and needs, etc. The other element that also tries to reunite or link these two elements, which is a big elephant in the room. What do we do with the indicators and trying to establish certain goals for our indicators in a global approach. We have certain examples, but everything needs to be refined, of course. We're thinking about it in a gradual manner. I'm just giving you some examples about the first two stages, the risk and vulnerability assessment and planning as well, where we also include planning and the system for monitoring and learning. What we're looking for here is global goals towards 2030 that can be established in the political cycle and that at the same time with associated indicators, and that we can also think about it to finance it in each and one of these stages to each uh, goal that we are stating. That way we can have an indicator associated to financing that we understand it interlinked with what we're establishing or established in last year's decision. We understand that it's fundamental to understand it for the next cycle because in the implementation we can incorporate certain additional elements about results and not only about processes. And at the same time, we can also incorporate through different examples the enabling conditions that I was referring to. And just to finish off, given that my time is up, I just like to say that we understand that it's key that the negotiation process and whatever we adopt this year is already linked to the next cycle. And then that graduality needs to understand what we could have done so far with the review of the process and what we couldn't, and to try and avoid this for the next cycle. That's why it's important to tie it down with the systems of reporting information. I leave it at that. And of course, I'd like to thank you again the possibility for collaboration.
Pilar, muchas gracias.
Yeah,
Ha
thank you
sido
very much. It's been
muy
a
interesante
really
y
interesting
precisamente
intervention. And just to keep on
una pequeña
the ball
charla
rolling
pues
with this topic, we'll have a
presentamos
bit of a discussion that will be hosted by you,
Moneo, por
by
favor.
Marta Moneo. Please, the table's yours, the floor is yours. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone. I'm Marta Moneo. I'm the coordinator for the climate change coordination team for the PNUMA, and I'll have the opportunity of moderating this conversation that we will have with four panelists that will be able to give us uh, a vision of what is the reality, what are the opportunities, the challenges that this global goal of adaptation represents. For this panel, we have Angela Rivera, which is the consultant for international affairs and climate change for Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. She is a part of APAILA, one of the negotiation groups in international negotiation, especially for climate adaptation and losses and damages. We also have Lucilene, which is a technical assistant from the National Office of Climate Change and Sustainable Climate Environment of Argentina, led by the group ABU. It's a group led by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. We also have Elena Pereira, which is the technical consultant for finances and adaptation for climate change. We have the national plan of the group of the national plan for adaptation in Honduras, and with Cristina Rodriguez, which is the director of climate change adaptation in the Ministry of Environment of Peru. Good morning, everyone. I think that we are missing Christina, but she will probably come in a while. As you can see, we have first question. We have representatives of the different approaches and different approaches still that are part of the negotiation group that participate in these international negotiations and the representatives from governments. So we would like to have these two perspectives. For Angela, um, our first question will be in these negotiations that we are holding regarding the annual goal for an adaptation. We would like to hear about the discussions that you have been taking a part of. What are the focus of this framework to define a global goal, to talk about it in COP28, and to take into consideration the processes that countries are going regarding monitoring, adaptation, and what are also the challenges that these countries are facing in regards to this goal. So we can maybe start with Angela. Yes, thank you very much for the invite. I'll try to be brief. And maybe I would like to tell you that one of the main difficulties that we've had in negotiations or international negotiations is that not all countries are clear about what do we mean with that framework, global framework that will help to the progress of the global goals on adaptation. Among these discussions, countries say informally that we can take into account the adaptation kind of framework that was established in 2010 that had also to do in the adaptation committee and started having a part of the monitoring and evaluation systems. In country development, we want to increase visibility in adaptation to make sure that we have monitoring systems and evacuation of our countries that are strong and efficient, and of course, to measure the effectiveness and efficiency of the work that we are doing in adaptation. The most important for these negotiations and the agreement among parts is that all countries will need to be able to get to this common understanding of what this new framework is and what do we want to achieve with this new framework, this new global framework about the global goal adaptation. The understandings are different, and of course, financing is still an important part in our discussion. And they still try to understand what the resources that countries in development are going to have to comply with the framework and what are going to be the goals and the indicators that are going to allow us to achieve or to evaluate the compliance of these adaptation goals. So we have different types of understanding, but we have an effort that countries are doing, and the world in development is paying overall because we have an agreement among parts, and of course we want to get into this agreement about what we want to achieve, what are our goals, and it would be ideal that we can achieve some indicators that will allow us to measure the implementation of these goals and how are we influencing towards that global goal and adaptation. Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. Luz, let me open the mic for you. Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you very much, everyone, for the invite. I am aligned with what Angela said. I believe that the challenges that we need to tackle on are the substance and the content of the different elements that are already present in this dimension, as we heard before. I believe that this is the type of work that we have to do to understand what are the dimensions, the topic, the horizontal topics, which are already somehow defined, and especially to discuss and put in the table what, like Angela said, what is the joint understanding that we have of the framework? At least from our point of view, it's important because our understanding is that it will give us guidance, at least initially, because we can keep on improving it or how to tackle an objective that's defined. This is another type of understanding that we already have. You know that the global goal adaptation has three elements, so we need to agree upon what are the different indicators or the different approaches, qualitative, quantitative, so we can land them. We need to look at the elephant in the room, like the previous speaker said, and I would like to mention as well different elements that can contribute to this shared understanding that Angela mentioned that for our groups is fundamental. First off, we need to understand that having a framework it doesn't only give us guidance, and that's something that we need, but also it will give us an added value that's multiple. And it will depend on the decision that we have or we're going to make a difference that it has. This has to do with the added value of getting a multiple number of stakeholders with a different approach horizontally from bottom to top as well to understand what is the global view. That's why we need all these different stakeholders. And as we said before, too, from top to bottom focus, how these national elements are giving us the opportunity to articulate the different institutions and international processes. And for us, that's also a piece of understanding that we've shared that reflects this framework and of the goals that we want to achieve. And on the other hand, additionally, from our own interpretation, we are allowed to interpret this link between the different areas, because if we have different areas of the government that are incorporating climate elements or matters related to drugs or gender issues, for example, all of this will be reflected in the framework of CCA. And in a way, it will allow us to undergo an evaluation of how we are towards the end of the year. That's on one hand. And just to finish off, I believe that the added value will be of having this framework and some of the challenges as well as countries in development in Latin America has to do with strengthening the processes of monitoring and assessment nationally. Definitely, we need to have this guidance and these dimensions and these topics with a structure that we can already have a glimpse of for next year's meeting. In a way, as a government, it allows us to enable the monitoring systems with these dimensions, and at the different reporting elements, we can also develop a more guided type of report. We I want to rest assured that what we're reporting has an impact in the global process. So I'll just leave it at that so we can keep on having the conversation. Thank you very much, Luz. And I think that you've mentioned quite some interesting topics that we are going to be able to discuss in these upcoming panels, because we are going to have representatives from these different spokes and stakeholders from bottom to top that will have to contribute to the construction of this goal and to construct or build its capacities. And from that point of view, we probably can think of a national perspective with the participation of Elena and Christina. Good morning again. And the question for you would be this. What is facing this goal or this landscape that we're looking at internationally? What is status of preparation of countries, their reporting verification systems? Now for adaptation, what are maybe the opportunities and needs that countries have, as Angela was mentioning as well, to be able to commit to the goal and to contribute to the systems?
Yes. Muchas gracias, Marta,
Thank you very
gracias,
much,
Ángela.
Martha and Angela. Thank you very much for your previous interventions.
Creo que
I believe that
todo el marco y una vez que
the whole framework, and once we achieve the confirmation of the global goals of adaptation,
orientar a los procesos
I believe that it will guide the national processes of adaptation. There's countries that already have their own maps, and there's countries that don't. So for countries that don't yet, it will be easy, or it will be really useful guidance in this process of adaptation, in the planning process or in the study process of planning and such, where we can create these goals and how can we achieve these goals throughout time. Countries such as Honduras already have their national chart for adaptation and their own commitment. And I believe that it's a matter of how that ties down with what's already being uh, compromised regarding adaptation and the national plan that will be the framework of the goals.
esto un poco en el sentido de que también
This is in the sense that once we have indicators, objectives, clear goals,
yo creo que eso viene
I believe that
abonar a los procesos
it will aid the processes. Like in Honduras, for example, we are still in the process of identification.
de los
What are
compromisos
the indicators of commitments that
en
we have as
materia
a country in matters of adaptation?
pero los procesos que todavía
But
no
the
están
processes that are not clear yet,
claros,
meaning Honduras is under a process of setting up indicators that would then become monitoring and evaluation systems, but that will also enable the processes of financing for these adaptation measures, which is one of the weaknesses that many of the countries have.
claro, decimos las necesidades de los países en desarrollo están en la adaptación, lo refleja el reporte de las necesidades que
When we say that the needs of the countries in development are in adaptation,
pero no es
it then immediately relates to financing, but the financing level that's reported of needs in adaptation is not paired up with what's being reported, because we cannot uh, account for this measures. We don't know how much it will cost to adapt them. That's the problem. So by defining this type of indicators, we would it would give countries some sort of guidance to do all of this type of measurement of indicators and metrics that would enable the financing process or the coding process, and then we can know how much we need, so we can ask for that financing, and then how that ties together with the financing process within the community, or if we're going to have an objective of a sub goal of financing for adaptation in the framework of the negotiation process for financing
y todos los procesos
and all the processes
de, de cómo se va a financiar la
of how are we going to finance adaptation, what are the stakeholders, where are the national and international flow coming from to achieve that. So to my criteria, these will be supporting processes of financing for adaptation to be able to have this quoting or these quotes so we can understand how much financing do we need.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, Elena, por traer
Thank you very
también
much, Elena, for
de
bringing into the table this aspect of the contribution that this
para
group can
definir
have to define or to estimate better the
inversión
needs of investment.
Cristina, buenos días.
Christina, good morning. I'll open the mic for you. Good morning, Martha. Good morning, everyone present here. Thank you very much for the invite. Thank you for inviting people to contribute to these discussions for global goals on adaptation, and especially to provide some sort of outlook on how, from countries and from our own national systems, we can contribute to these discussions. We also do proper follow-up of this type of advances in discussions, and we are also aware of all the needs that this type of adaptation approach has. To be able to define this type of indicators, we do hope that from this goal, we can have a clearer guidance, so we can have a clearer identification of common goals to understand quantitative and qualitative indicators that will also allow us to make a difference among vulnerabilities and contexts that we have throughout countries. As Elena mentioned as well, we also hope that this can help us to leverage greater financing for adaptation needs. In the case of Peru, we are also in the cluster of countries that have a national plan for adaptation. In the monitoring side of it and evaluation, we have defined two indicators. And we still are under construction for our baselines. We were able to move forward with one, and when we wanted to assess these baselines, it was hard for us because we didn't have necessarily a UN available for that. So it's something that we wanted to achieve for our next indicators, and then we will be able to look at the beginning of the estimates for this. We know that the challenge is quite large, especially for adaptation plans for mitigation, especially because it's looking after sharing information on how are we going to move forward. But we do see some limitations, and we can see about some alleged in some cases. I'm mentioning this because by knowing this type of difficulties, we see that there's an exchange between countries where we understand we can help them in a different situation. So the exchange, so they should increase. We need to support each other to identify these indicators that are hard. NDCs have indicators, and particularly the 84 measures that are a part of our indices in adaptation have also provided us with indicators, and they're diverse because they are from different sectors. In this case, we're talking about of at least mitigation measures for five sectors, and each one of it has a different theme to it. Each measure has its own indicator, and we have designed a monitoring component, a monitoring and assessment component for our national system in their measures of adaptation. So we are designing some sort of a roadmap for this component. And again, we are working with the sectors. We realize that information it's not only in one place, and even so, it would change between sectors. So this work is something that we hope it contributes to the global discussion. We're also convinced that information needs to come from the territories itself, from cases, and from there it can also contribute. So we hope that we can get to some advances, looking after financing, of course. This monitoring and evaluation thing is something that Peru focuses on a lot, and we sometimes depend on the cooperation to move forward with the challenges that we are facing. And that's it. I think that we will carry on with our work, and we will understand what other countries in the region are also a part of this effort to move forward and to monitor and to be able to assess how are we moving forward, how are we reducing our risk related to climate change, and alongside it, to reduce the gaps for financing. And it's important for us, or the follow up, for example, for climate um, financing for mitigation. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristina. Gracias a
Thank you very
todas.
much,
Creo que
Christina, and
a
thank you very
través
much,
de estas
everyone. I
cuatro
think that
intervenciones
through
hemos
these
podido
four
ver
interventions,
bueno, la
we've
naturaleza
been
desde
painting a
que
whole
deja
landscape
de
that,
quizá la
in a
necesidad
way,
de colaboración
leaves me understanding how great the collaboration is between
entre
different
actores,
levels and among different stakeholders.
la utilidad que puede tener esta
How
ayuda para
useful can
realmente
this goal be to
una
really
adaptación
provide
a los
guidance to
actores
all of the
para
stakeholders in regards to the definition of the indicators on how are we measuring resilience and adaptation
de
to
cómo
climate
puede tener una
change?
utilidad también
How can it also
para
be
definir
useful to
las
define
necesidades
a
de
need,
inversión
for example, of
para
investment in adaptation?
y cómo realmente hay que seguir
And
trabajando
how can we or should we move forward understanding or
pero
working
también
towards common understanding nationally,
la
internationally,
implementación
and
de
subnationally?
de los planes
How
nacionales de adaptación,
important these adaptation plans are,
en otros países más territorial, en otros países está todavía muy
and in
enfocado
different countries we
en
are
entender
still
cuáles son
concerned
los
about
riesgos
defining and
en la
understanding the risks that the country is facing.
Bueno, parece que tenemos una pequeña dificultad.
en el que participarán otros sectores y
And
actores
for other
relacionados.
sectors and stakeholders of the
Más gracias.
civil society, thank you very much to all of you. Have a good day.
Marta, muchas gracias. Y
Martha,
pues
thank
bueno,
you very
como
much.
comentado
And
antes,
like we mentioned
Fabiana
before, we
Rodríguez
have a guest, Fabiana
pudo
Rodriguez. She was
los
able
temas
to
técnicos
solve her
de
technical
mejora.
problems. So please, Fabiana, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días a
Thank
todos.
you very much. Thank you to all of the participants. I'm sorry about the technical problems that I had. It's a real pleasure to be here with you in this first virtual seminar webinar to talk about the Latin America and Caribbean perspectives, especially in Latin America. I'd like to thank our colleagues from PNUM, from UNEP, and I would like to please ask you to move the slide for me to our colleagues of UNEP because I'm not going to be able to.
Bueno, gracias.
My presentation, I hope that I can complement what's already been said. It was prepared as an introduction, actually, to the global goal for adaptation, but I hope that I can complement and not to repeat anything that's said before. It's a really introductory part of it. It's just to give you a brief introduction about the basic goals of the program of work of the goal, and then I would like to make a brief summary about the four workshops that we had in 2022 and what happens after Glasgow. The third part has to do with what came out of the Charlie Shake teenager discussion and the plan for 2023. I believe that we have problems with internet of our office, but just let me know if you can still hear me or not. Next slide, please.
Bien, te estamos oyendo
We
perfectamente.
can hear you perfectly. Well, briefly, as Article 7 says for Paris Agreement, the global goals on adaptation are to improve resiliency, to reduce vulnerability, and to increase the capacity and adaptation. This is a link that we want to do with Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Convention, that talks about the levels of reduction of this type of incidents. And in the third part of the agreement, it was decided to establish and to put in much integral type of program in the goal or global goal for adaptation on adaptation. What we're doing is to try to complete these components with our statements to be able to get to a second level of details for the global goals on adaptation. That means that all parties need to find out how to convert something tangible, something that is a legislation, for example, a change of behavior, or an objective of development towards or a long-term goals that can become an investment for countries, like we have already mentioned. What are the needs? And that's why the work program establishes relation to get to this point. Well, as we can see on screen, this is a 2-year program that will end up in COP28 in Dubai this year. Next slide, please. Quickly, the working program has to reach 8 objectives. I'm not going to read them out here because you probably know them quite well, but I would like to group them up for a better understanding. We divide them in three main groups, three elements. The first one would be to improve planning in the national application, specifically to reinforce application of the goal and in the countries of development of vulnerable will be as a second group to understand the matrix and meteorological indicators and establish a model for monitoring and evaluation. The third one will be to help the parts out on communicating their needs of adaptation and plans of support. Next slide, please. We have a landscape of last year's schedule timeline and what happened after COP26 in Glasgow. Well, these are all the events that are planned out or that already happened in the first part of 2022, where we had four workshops where we had over 60 proposals. Before the first workshop, we also had an IPCC event in response to an invite from MCA to report on the work that we've done introducing the work on Group 2 condition. Then we had the first workshop right after that, and it generated a cluster and summary of a matrix of indicators, focus, approaches, and goals that was available in our webpage. Next one, please. During the first workshop, the participants tried to respond to some questions such as how should they characterize the global goals on adaptation, what are the good practices, good habits, goal establishment, or how can we learn from other forums, and what are the pertinent examples of goals, achievements, and indicators at different levels.
También se debatió sobre los
We also
diferentes
discussed the different
niveles de
thresholds
ambición
and
de
levels
los
of
países.
ambition that countries aspire to achieve.
Ya el segundo se centró más en la
Then the second group focused more on the goals and the capacity of decision to improve action, including the availability of data and information, the need of capacity for the different parts of adaptation, monitoring, and also we talked a lot about the lack of resources for financing for countries in development.
Bueno,
We've already mentioned this before. The next one, please. We also conducted a third workshop that was focused on indicators, data at different levels, starting out by the global level. Then we focused on at the regional level, and then some important takeaways that I can highlight, for example, are that we've already mentioned before, I think. We talked about the Office for the United Nations for the Reduction of Risk and Disasters that we've already mentioned in the mechanism advancements and the mechanism of governance, where we saw the increase of damages caused by disasters. And IPCC also mentioned the approach, and one of the examples that it included was in the presentation was the diagram that assesses or evaluates the reduction of risk aggregated to regional sectors. The organization of worldwide meteorology was focused mainly in the extreme events and in the work that the OMM is doing with the early alert systems to try and comply with the General Secretary's goals on early alert for 5 years. Overall, the participants recognized that they weren't or they couldn't all have one only solution given the diversity of the impact of climate change and the availability of data. So most probably was that this took place as a mixed focus or approach, and that probably is the path to follow. And just before we focus on the introduction and presentation of all this. I'm not going to take much time, but I'd just like to highlight a couple of examples. The one from South Africa that shared its experience because they gather adaptation measures and with a really interesting tool that's being used to supervise the contribution for the intervention on adaptation. And that has a data base of vulnerability and some toolboxes. Another important example was from Italy, where they described how communication and the presentation of the approach on adaptation would contribute to the adaptation platform of climate change from the European Union, and they would pick up information from portals from the different member governments or member states. Well, we had the four workshops in 2022 that became an improvement of workshops in the improvement of the global goals for adaptation framework that we are working under. That's the previous one.
No, 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 está bien, está bien. Este informe
And this report
bueno, también enfocado en el
is
progreso
also focused on the real process for the compliance of rules. If you go to our webpage, now we have the decision of Charlie Shaker 2023. But one of the results, or the main results maybe, for that decision was the mandate to reduce the cost and improve the global goal on adaptation. This 2023, for all the parts and all stakeholders that are interested can participate on the debate and work toward the development of the structural framework of the working program, meaning we can start the development of a framework for a global goal that would take place through a structural focus under the working program of a Glasgow Transition, looking towards the adopted framework, towards the adoption of the framework in FCA 5, which would be uh, for COP23, COP28 in 2023.
No, no, este mismo, el siguiente,
No, next one, please.
estamos. Bueno,
Well,
gracias. Los trabajos ya
thank you.
empezaron con el taller 5 este año.
Work already started this year in March, where the participants already held discussions, enriched discussions about the global goal of adaptation and how can it give us an outlook towards adaptation, transformation, adaptation, as we've said, here to facilitate the mindset and to learn of all the knowledge and values and indigenous wisdom. For example, next workshop we'll talk about the incorporation of adaptation and establishment of objectives and methodology and indicators that will happen in Bonn during the sessions, which will take place in June. Workshop 7A is still to be confirmed, but I can get ahead, give you some more information that it's thematically be the interface of the global goal for our different processes and also on the different balances on the Glasgow Shine Machine. So we hope that the conclusion of this work can serve as
la meta global de
a
adaptación
guidance
del proceso
towards a global review for the general process to achieve it.
importante mencionar
It's important to
que
mention that
determinada
we have established in a decision to review this framework
mundial
from the second worldwide balance that will happen in
en eso
2028. So with that,
para quería agradecer
I would like
a
to
todos
thank all of you for
los
the
informes,
attention, the
eventos,
reports, events. I hope that you can check our webpage so you can access the documents. And any question, I have our teams or specialist teams emails
para la
for global
adaptación.
goals and adaptation
Bueno,
that are
muchas
inbound. And
gracias.
with that, thank you very much.
Dani, el micrófono, por favor.
Daniel, you're muted.
Muchas gracias, Javi. Fernanda, muchas
Thank you,
gracias.
Javi.
Ahora vamos a
Thank
dar
you very much,
paso
Fernanda.
a
Now
una
we'll open
pequeña
the
sesión
mic to an
liderada por Pilar,
roundtable
esta
led by
es la
Pilar on
presentación
open forum discussion, which has to do with the multi-stakeholder participation towards our goal. I would like to remind you that please
que
in
las
your
vamos
question,
a responder en una
just write them in the chat, and you will
cierre.
respond it at in a small Q&A session at the end of the event. So just leave them there. Thank you very much, Pilar. Just go ahead.
Muchas gracias, Daniel.
Thank you very much,
La
Daniel.
verdad que el panel sumamente interesante, la primera parte,
It's been a
vinculada
really
a
interesting panel with
la
experiences,
segunda
national
parte vamos
experiences.
a tener la oportunidad
In the
de
second
charlar
part, we will have a chance, as Daniel said,
con
to have a chat with representatives from different stakeholders,
el enfoque local de las
including the local
ciudades,
focus of cities, and as for the organizations,
experiencias
from the
participativas,
experiences of Latin America,
no
and as
ATA o
Marta mentioned in the
comunitarios. En el primer panel
conclusions
es clave,
in
como
the first
decía,
panel, it's key. These are keys to try and carry out a vision of these conversations on how Latin America looks at the processes of Latin America and its implementation from COP28, from an outlook of all the stakeholders,
también a cuatro
from a point of view of all stakeholders. That's why we have these four panelists in this part, where we are going to have an opportunity to first off hear Ignacio Lorenzo, whom was Director for Climate Change in the Ministry of Housing uh, and Environment Ministry, and now is the Director of the Cleaning in the Intendancy of Montevideo Direction, and to be able to share with Carmen Rivero the Nature for Cities project in Dominican Republic.
A ambos me
Both, I would
gustaría
like to
preguntarles
ask you
generales, por
in general
supuesto,
terms, of course,
un poco que cómo podemos
how
incorporar
can we
a la mirada de las ciudades
incorporate
dentro
the
de
city's outlook in this discussion of the
por ahora
ability for
muy
our
vinculada a las
frameworks that
nacionales,
it's really
relaciones
focused on the national process, and we understand that also
lo
in
que ya
the
están haciendo
mindset of
las ciudades
cities
para
and what are the
hacia
cities
la
doing to
igualdad,
or
hacia
contribute
la
towards the
equidad.
adaptation measure
Me
global
parece
goals and adaptation. So if you think, Karen, if that's okay, you can start. Thank you very much, Pilar, and thank you very much for the invite to be a part of this important panel where we can talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in all the countries of Latin America and Caribbean for global goals and adaptation. And as you mentioned, Pilar, what do we need to incorporate for the cities to reflect this type of actions? Well, I would like to start by saying that every local action in the process of adaptation includes really quickly the national and international processes. And starting from this premise and understanding that one of the objectives of the global goals on adaptation and framed in the framework of the Paris Agreement is to encourage collective action. And as we know, it includes resiliency, reducing vulnerability to nations for climate change. And according to the qualitative focus that adaptation has, it's important to understand that adaptation needs to have an holistic vision where all the stakeholders intervene, understanding what are the differentiated impact, and to understand the different challenges that we have, social, environmental, financial, but especially to understand opportunities that it brings with it. It's important to understand what the collective adaptation means, common adaptation means, and if it's true that it comes from a local event, and their impact comes from a global event, but really localized. And these require studies and efforts of the nation that are localized, that go from communities, localities, cities, and of course its surroundings. To understand this, local action needs to be framed in the goal itself, and this effort needs to be framed about capacities and strengthening capacities of community to understand what is the dynamic of this adaptation, leaning towards needs and the critical areas and how to face these eventualities. To give an example, it's important to create a communicative, participatory process with a transversal approach and for methodologies that are used to fit local capacities, evidently the needs of countries. That's why I think that it allows us to reduce inequalities, so we can work towards uh, climate transition that's fair. And I understand that to move forward in the global goals, we shouldn't just look at a national perspective, but we should dive into the cities and communities, the local governments, decision makers. And if it's true, countries are the ones facing communication wise, the processes need to be carried out at all levels. Thank you very much, Karen, for your intervention. I would like to know if Ignacio Lorenzo can also participate right now. Ignacio, can you hear us?
Ignacio, puede ser que estés muteado.
Ignacio, you might be muted.
Hola.
Ahí está.
Hello?
Perfecto. Muchas
Perfect,
gracias.
that's it. Thank you very much.
Si estás teniendo algún problema con
If
la
you have
conexión,
a problem with your
puedes
connection,
bajar el video
maybe
más
you can
al
just
cabo lo más
shut
importante para
down
escucharte.
your camera, and the important thing here is to see you or to hear you. If not, can we, can we go to the next speaker, please, if you like, adjust my corrections?
Gracias, Ignacio. Esperamos
Thank you very much, Ignacio. We hope to hear from you in a little while. I'd like to give the opportunity to the other two speakers, Elsa Fernandez, who's a senior associate in the climate diplomacy team of Transforma, and Santiago Nunez, which is a specialist in the private sector in matters of adaptation, and currently a senior consultant of sustainability in Invictus.
y justamente por su rol
And
actual
just because of its current role, in both cases, I would like them to give us their perspective in regards of the participation and the role of the civil society organizations in Latin America in this whole conversation, and the civil society associations in the private sector related to this goal. What is the support that they already have and how to reflect
del marco
on
de la
the
meta
build-up
global de
of the
adaptación.
global
¿Te
goals for
parece?
adaptation. If you think, Edgar, we can hear you.
Sí, muchas gracias, Pilar.
Thank you very much,
Muchas
Pilar.
gracias a Penuma y a
Thank you very
Adaptation
much.
la
I would
invitación a
like to
Transforma.
thank everyone. I would like to thank UNEP, Transforma, for letting me participate of this webinar. I believe
Hay
that
una forma,
a way
bueno, de que la acción local y los
for local
desafíos
action and what
sociedad civil
civil society is doing to be able to be
en el
perfected
marco de la meta
in the framework of the goal,
a través del
it's
establecimiento
through
de
the
este marco
establishment in this framework that will be defined this year
criterio
of a
en la toma de
criteria.
decisiones sobre el manejo del riesgo climático y
So
adaptación,
in the decision making
establecer
of the
procesos
adaptation
que permitan
process,
integrar la
we can
información
have
y los
processes that would allow us to absorb knowledge
conocimientos.
that come from different knowledge systems, such as scientific,
Local,
indigenous,
eh,
local.
y un ejemplo de estos son
And a
los
clear
procesos
example of this are the
conocimientos
co-production processes of knowledge that can be
implementados por este marco de la
pushed
meta.
and encouraged by this compliance of the goal.
Procesos a menudo
This
promueven
process, they
la
regularly
integración de
promote these integration processes of knowledge. However,
requieren
and
más
of course, they need
tiempo,
a lot more time, a
inversión
lot more money, a lot more
de los participantes
participation of than conventional modalities of promotion for knowledge.
otro
Also,
criterio que puede establecerse en el
there's a
marco
criteria that can be established in the framework of the goal
para la toma de decisiones sobre
for
manejo
the
del
decision
riesgo y
making
adaptación.
on the adaptation
La
means.
definición de
This is
factores
also
habilitantes
the
para la
enabling
implementación
condition for the integration of
subnacional
what the subnational level does in
y
national,
se
of
ve la
course, related to planning
implementación,
and implementation and assessment and monitoring of
por ejemplo,
adaptation. For example,
esto se ha hecho como integración
we've
vertical,
called
donde
vertical integration, that's what we called it.
factores
In
habilitantes
some
que
enabling factors, for example, it could be
establecimiento de arreglos
to establish
institucionales,
institutional agreements that will enable dialogue between the local level and the
nacional
subnational level and
y
national level.
intercambio de
And then the
información,
exchange of information at different levels, the development
capacidades,
of
activación.
capacities of the different stakeholders at different
Más
levels
allá
too.
de lo
And
anterior,
beyond the
también
previous thing that I said, I also believe that
la
the
Meta Global de
framework
Adaptación
of the global
tiene
goals
una
on
serie de áreas
adaptation can identify
de
a
trabajo,
series of
cooperación,
areas of work and cooperation that will allow us to generate
promover la acción
products
local,
to influence local
de
action
manera que esta acción local
in
se
a way that this
relaciona
local action can also be
con la
framed
planificación de
within
largo plazo,
planning and condition at the
para
long
definir
term, because we know there's actions in the territory,
poder enmarcarse
but
en una
they
visión
should be framed under a
de largo plazo,
long-term vision and
establecimiento de acciones
taking into account the
de
forecasts for
desarrollo
climate change to the future
una escala que interese
at a
a
scale
diferentes
that is of the
eh,
local
que
level's
esos
interest.
proyectos para informar la acción
And
local
to
tenemos
report this type of actions, we
que
have the generation and improvement of
data e
what
información
is
climática
data and climatic information through the establishment
observar
of
que se reúnen
new and better observations of in situ
también el
monitoring
mejoramiento de los
and the improvement of services
servicios que se llaman los servicios
of what we call
climáticos,
climate services.
ello de forma a que se pueda
This
producir
is done, or we can do it in a way where we can do climate forecasting that can be of the use of the proper scales and of the proper specific uses at the local level. And of course, without leaving aside the most vulnerable people and isolated people. That'd be all.
Muchísimas gracias, Edgar,
Thank you
por
very
ese
much, Edgar,
aporte y bueno, al igual
for
que
that input.
Karem también. Y me gustaría
Just as Karen.
ahora
And I
tener la
would like to
posibilidad
now give the opportunity to
a
our
Santiago Núñez,
colleague Santiago Nunez from
también pueda
Invictus so he can
hacer su
also
intervención.
do or give us his intervention.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you very
Pilar.
much, Pilar.
Una
Thank you very much, UNEP, for the
esta
invite. It's a real pleasure to be here. Now I'd like to highlight two aspects that are important in the global goals on adaptation and how the private sector and organizations The civil society organizations within the private sector are also getting involved within these global goals on adaptation. The first thing is that from the private sector, we can manage projects of towards climate change that would include communities. So there's a huge possibility to have joint work between companies and territories, which are mainly where we see the influence of climate change and where we see the highest vulnerability as well. These projects can be solutions nature-based, ecosystem-based, and for them to work, they need to go to this local action. They cannot be disarticulated. We cannot take apart local from private. Second of all, there's a step where we see all these companies moving forward, where we see the physical risk analysis. These risk analysis need to be an analysis based on surroundings and need to take it into account important actions for the physical risk analysis that's related to the climate change actions. And understanding, of course, from companies that adaptation is a competitive and competitiveness. We need to speak in the language of the private sector more generally. So that's something that I've noticed. From the public sector and from the international organizations, the language doesn't fit or doesn't include the private sector the way that it should. And talking about competitiveness, productivity, reduction of cost, and so on. And that is something that seems to be simple, but it's a complex type of thing. As we are talking in our different languages, we will understand and we will try to fit what we want to say for adaptation and local goals as well. And I think that's something that I would like to highlight from the private sector is the incorporation of local suppliers. Part of this is financial vulnerability, and from companies we need to include local production and improve the chain supply. And that way we will be able to have a less amount of vulnerable people towards the effects of climate change, and that will be a way of aligning the efforts of the global goals on adaptation for climate change. And from organizations of civil society that are also involved with the private sector, the mechanisms of participation are really important. And we've mentioned, or Heidegger mentioned, that as we have more participation, we would have a more democratic decision making and planning of the territory, a planning of the upcoming years, of the areas and countries. We will have better alignment with these local goals and adaptation for climate change. And I would like to raise here, and just to finish out, two mechanisms that I believe are really important and that are also were also mentioned in the previous panel. Elena mentioned NAPS, or National Plans for Adaptation to Climate Change, and we have an important point here. What will happen with countries that already had NAPS that went aligned to the global goals for climate change? Probably we will have an evolution of the national plans for adaptation to climate change. In the case of Colombia, for example, the National Plan of Adaptation to Climate Change involves the private sector as a strategy of involvement for the private sector, and from there we made a tool for companies to go through a basic measurement of the process of adaptation to climate change. But how does it need to change? This whole process needs to change in Colombia specifically because it involves four governmental entities. And how would that evolve to adapt to that global goals on adaptation for climate change in those countries that don't have an app? I think it will be something rather simpler to be able to couple up and to merge into that mechanism. And like Christina mentioned, we have the MADC. Colombia has had an evolution in the NDC. First, it was only for mitigation for climate change. In 2020, they included adaptation topics. They included to the territory, to private sector. 8 companies of the private sector had the goals between the NDS, and we also need to think about that. How did the NDS evolve? Probably for towards 2025, and how are we going to get these companies involved, including um, specific measures of global goals on adaptation to climate change? I believe that these are the main points that I would like to highlight. Thank you very much, Santiago. And to be able to finish off this part of the panel, I would like to go back to Ignacio Lorenzo so we can give the opportunity for him to intervene. Yes, I hope that you can all hear me. we're in the summit of the Americas in
justamente
Denver, Colorado. And
ante
one of the things that we are working on in this summit has to do with adaptation to climate change in cities. This is an agenda that has been broadening strongly in this last decade.
comentarios
With just a couple of comments or initial comments, we are under a process in this last decade of moving forward with local planning of adaptation. Many of our cities in the Americas already have local plans for climate change. Some of them specialize in adaptation, mitigation, but with a more robust type of agenda. Within this agenda, the aggregate effect of the added effect of the work in cities and local territory, it's a fundamental asset to what national processes are of planning for adaptation and also of reporting with the convention. In the case of Montevideo, we are the main city or biggest population in Uruguay. And we need to consider a little bit of the actions or mitigation and actions that we have in Montevideo. Uh, We have a high or severe rainfall. Mitigation measures have to do with nature-based solutions, and we start building up an important agenda related to national planning and also related to transparency and action in the support in the international scope. In that sense, Uruguay also mm, it highlights its structure of adaptation where they build a specific app for cities and infrastructure where we see how important the cities are given the amount of population, but also its effect from the vulnerability and resiliency in the national and global importance. We have many, many challenges, of course, in what has to do with the strengthening of this vulnerability at the local level. We have lack of data, institutional capacities that are limited, and of course, the link with the national and subnational level are sometimes influenced by this type of situations.
Te perdimos, Ignacio.
We lost you, Ignacio.
Ahí ya nos comentaba Ignacio dónde se
Ignacio was
encuentra
telling us
y
where is
cuán
he
difícil
at
es
and
esta
how
conectada
difficult it was to
con
get connected to this.
situación. De cualquier manera,
Well,
si Ignacio
anyway, if
vuelve
Ignacio comes back
en el tramo de preguntas, por ahí a lo
and
mejor
in the
podemos
Q&A session, maybe we
compartir
have some time, we can probably
por
go
mi
back
parte, digamos,
on
y
my
sumado
end and just to
intervenciones de
talk about the
aquellas y
interventions of those
formaron parte
that were a part
del panel.
of this panel.
Gustaría resaltar
I would
algunos
like to highlight
pensamientos
a couple of ideas, and of
en
course,
primer lugar,
thank you first off
la relevancia
for how important
multinivel,
this multi-level
que
approach
holística que
is.
se
This
refería
holistic
Karen
approach
al
that
inicio,
Karen
justamente cada uno
mentioned
de
at the beginning,
los
where
componentes pueda
every
atender también
component
a las
can also
necesidades y
respond to
capacidades
the
de
needs
las
and
ciudades, como
capacities of cities and of
civiles,
civil
privados,
societies,
comprender
organizations, and
justamente
private sector. And that way we can understand that
tiene que variar
adaptation needs
todo
to deal
y
positively
esta sinergia positiva
with a positive
dentro de las
synergy
dinámicas
between
globales,
this
nacionales
global,
y
national dynamic, and national
esta
and a just
local
being such
naturaleza
so local
la
in its
naturaleza
nature when we talk
en
about
ese sentido.
adaptation and traditional as
Ignacio
well.
se refiere
In that
a
sense,
la aplicación
Ignacio
de los NAPs
referred to
tanto
NAPS
en el plano local y
just for the
regional,
local plane as well and how
gran
important
avanzada de
it is for our
desarrollo
cities to move forward with the
sostenible.
planning.
Y también Santiago
And Santiago
mencionaba
also
la
mentioned
importancia de que
how
otros
important it
instrumentos
is for all the instruments of
de
adaptation, CNDC, will add up
adaptación
to the communication needs. And that's where the process of participation of the different
factoras de
stakeholders of our region
llevar a este
would
nuevo
need
ciclo
to get to the new cycle
contribuciones,
of
este nuevo ciclo de
contribution,
adaptación,
new cycle of
contemplando
ambition,
la adaptación desde todos los
contemplating
puntos,
adaptation from all these points of
como
view
lo
because we
explica
understand that it
cada
won't be enough
único actor
with
o
the
una medida
with the point of view of only one actor
en
or
ese
only the
sentido,
one at the national level. In that sense, the participative process, methodology, inclusive methodology, and the conditions, enabling
vimos
conditions,
algunos
We also have
propuestas
with a
que
group of
estaba él,
proposals that Edgar mentioned related to infrastructure, to
administrando
Ignacio also
la
mentioned the
información,
access to
la gestión
information,
de datos,
the
y
data
esto a veces
building that many times is important to build
en
up in the
local,
national
cuando es
framework
a la
from our Latin American cities. And of course, it applies to communities.
en todo sentido,
So, in all senses, and
para
just
cerrar
to close up my
mencionar
intervention,
que
I would like to
cuando hablamos
mention
de
too that
de
when we talk
adaptación,
about the global goals and adaptation, and when we talk about the framework of it, even more so,
pasa que
there's a lot of
nosotros
circumstances that we believe are really strange from our communities' lives in Latin America, in our organizations or the private sector, in our own
el
cities.
plano global en
The
general
global framework overall,
un
specifically
manual
this
de algo,
framework, looks
tipo de
like
manual, entonces
it's kind of manual. So that one of our main challenges
oportunidad de
as a
capacitación
community of adaptation and as a Latin American community for
hacia fin de
adaptation
año
to towards the end of the years to be able to establish Latin American vision with all of these little bits and pieces and all these perspectives
que tienen nuestras
of gaps that our
organizaciones,
organizations have, the
diferentes
stakeholders have at
niveles,
all levels.
eh,
And to
alienta y
identify
alienta
what
comunes
is the
para
goal of the framework to as an
entonces
opportunity to test out what we're
también
doing, but
se
also
necesita saber qué es
everything
lo
that
que
we
queremos
need to
hacer
do and what we can do
como
collectively as well as the region.
no sé si
I don't know
Ignacio
if Ignacio, would you like to,
considera
or if you do have a possibility to,
de 2 minutos más.
we
No
have
sé
the
si
proper
ya
connection to
estaríamos
talk about it a
tratando
couple more
de
minutes, and then we
preguntas.
can go to the Q&A session.
Creo que Ignacio sigue con problemas
I
de
think that
conexión con el
Ignacio
video.
still
No
has
hay problema.
connection
Vamos a
problems, but no worries. We'll open the possibility
de esta conversación, que vamos a tener la oportunidad de tener algunas preguntas de la audiencia.
from the audience.
Nuevamente.
Así es, Pilar. Bueno, muchas gracias por
That's
el
right,
panel.
Pilar. Thank you very much for that panel.
Una sesión de preguntas y
As you
respuestas.
mentioned, we're going to go to a Q&A session.
Especialistas, para que ustedes puedan precisamente hacerles más preguntas y ahondar de pronto en algunas particularidades de las conversaciones.
And when we're going to have all of the panelists, so we can ask them more questions and maybe deepen in some of the particularities of the conversation that we had. So please, I would like to open now the mic to Marta again, which is a coordinator of
Muchas gracias,
adaptation.
Daniel. Muchísimas gracias a
Thank you very
todos,
much, Daniel. Thank you very
todas las
much, everyone,
distintas
for the intervention and for having all these perspectives. As we said at the beginning, they have been building up a really realistic view of where are we standing at this point. In reality, in the definition of the global goal for adaptation, and thanks for all the comments that we are getting in the chat. I believe that there's an element, an evident element that could be or could mean the difference, this abysmal difference that we have in the goals for mitigation and the goals for adaptation, and that would be local, the need of observing reality and local context in regards of adaptation, because the effort in adaptation, beyond having that benefit at the global level, it also requires a really localized observation of the context and the needs. You will have an impact, especially on that level. So I would like to start by looking at that, looking at the comments that we've had from the audience that go really reflected towards considering the national realities, but also local ones that we've heard in these interventions of these last four panelists. How each collaboration, each horizontal collaboration that we mentioned at the beginning, at multi levels, from the global to the local scope, and also between different stakeholders that are not only governmental, but will also include civil society, the private sector, and the need of building then these mechanisms and all these platforms for dialogue among all the stakeholders. Maybe I would like to start by asking a question to Karen and Ignacio. Oh, that goes more leaning towards that for Karen and Ignacio. I would say that at the city level, municipality level, we're moving forward so much into developing adaptation plans to build this whole vision of resiliency of territories and a need of action to build that resiliency. But also the reality is that we still have a lot of limitations to identify this at the local level or to participate also in the access to financing at the local level. And maybe to ask you, in that sense, what are the networks of collaboration that we're building among between cities, or what are the efforts that we are looking at from the local level for cities and municipalities and is places to have a voice and participation in definition of the on the adaptation of global goals and adaptation. I think that we are losing. Unless I'm not carrying something to share with us. Yes, thank you, Martha, for that question. I believe that it is important to mention it because we are working from the cities and we are looking at these challenges that are important and that we want tackled. I think it's important to create mechanisms and of participation among cities and stakeholders that will allow us to get to know what is the problematic situation that these communities are facing that we know are latent and we know that are affected by climate change. We need to understand what the role is that everyone can play here, because if not, because we all have a role from our different scopes to provide first-hand information, to get to know witnesses of surroundings, to support initiatives, especially as Santiago mentioned, to strengthen the articulation processes among these sectors, local actors, to have their involvement. And third, I understand that strengthening dialogue mechanisms, the participatory mechanisms, and strengthening documents and public policies for countries that allow to encourage and promote the participation of the stakeholders in the climate agenda. I think that it's not less important to also identify adaptation as a challenge, but rather as an opportunity and what it represents, where we can establish mitigation measures and they can create job positions, links between cities, the sustainable economy, and go to the innovative processes. So establishing these dialogue mechanisms and participative processes without a doubt is the place that we want to tackle these challenges. That's where sometimes communication is not going through the two different levels, and this is the fundamental base to face these challenges that we are looking at in the cities.
Gracias, Karen. No sé si tengo un poco
Thank
de
you,
retraso con
Karen. I
el
don't know if I have a little bit of delay with my
un poco agarrando esa
sound,
respuesta
but
que acabas de dar, quizá volviendo a
just talking
Santiago,
about that,
que Karen ha mencionado
that you, the thing that you said,
esta
because Santiago talked to us about the need of dialogue platforms and getting involved in these platforms,
no tradicionales.
the non-traditional stakeholders in the decision-making
Quizá
process of
volviendo
the
a tu
private
intervención,
sector.
Santiago,
Maybe going back to intervention, Santiago, in the concrete case of Colombia, where you mentioned that the private sector was already participating off of the adaptation national plan. Maybe I would like to ask you more concretely, how has that been established, those platforms?
esa
How were you
participación
able to
del
achieve that
sector
participation of the private
hacia
sector?
cuáles podrían ser
And what's
algunos
left to
de
do?
los elementos más
What are the
urgentes a
elements,
trabajar
the
para
most urgent
continuar y
elements
fortalecer ese
to keep on
involucramiento.
working and to keep the involvement of the private sector?
Gracias, Marta. Creo que es una
Thank you,
pregunta
Martha. I believe that that's a really complex question because there's still a lot to do.
es
The
particular,
Colombian
sí,
case is a particular case. There was a strategy for implementation for the climate change risk, focusing to keeping productivity. That was the goal, to talk about the private sector's in the private sector's language. First, we thought it was a involvement of the private sector, and then certain strategic reason we wanted to talk about a strengthening strategy of the private sector and not involvement. And what we wanted with it, that for the company to think of itself as a part of the system. It's not that I'm getting involved in the government strategy, but rather I'm strengthening my process of adaptation to climate change so we can make decisions. This is focused on different sectors, four sectors: water, agriculture, financial, and we took into account them as pilot sectors for the Colombian strategy. This is a really important strategy. It starts with a diagnose, a really deep diagnosis about how the situation is of each sector related to climate change, and from there we establish alternatives of involvement and alternatives of joint cooperation for the government and the private sector, where we take a roadmap, make a roadmap for all of the private sector to strengthen. And then after that, the development of a tool that was a really interesting tool. It's a really simple tool where companies can identify where are they in the process of adaptation to climate change. All of these aids towards the company to be seen in the process, to understand that it's a part of the process, and to stop thinking of climate change as mitigation, um, greenhouse emissions elimination, and to start thinking about how am I going to adapt to what's important here. And that's something that I mentioned a while ago, it's surrounding with environment analysis. That's really important to understand where the company is, to understand how communities work and how does the territory work in ecosystemic terms, of course, and how we have the interactions of the social, economical systems and social ecological system, which is really important to make concrete decisions in our surroundings related to climate change adaptation. And that makes a unity between communities that are in the area, the company that strengthens also certain financial aspects of this community, where we generate again certain tensions from the government. And as we have a good announcement on the environment, social, political, financial, and ecosystemic terms, we will have a better decision making. That's also a part of what we do in Victor's to try them to help to understand that there's some social surrounding or environment where we need to that we need to manage strategically and how to couple or how to pair decision making with the information that helps companies to make decisions based on what communities need, based on information. There's a new way of adapting information to climate change, to understand it as such, to understand that, okay, I have a flood problem in one of my facilities, and as a competitiveness of productivity, cost reduction, but of work at the same time with communities. For something that I've also mentioned to reduce the financial vulnerability. I think that's a good way of doing it, and related to the two mechanisms, the NAP and the NEDS, which are really important for that.
Muchísimas gracias, Santiago. Y creo que ya has
Thank you very much,
mencionado
Santiago. I believe that you mentioned something that it also had to do with what Edgar mentioned and said, and is that we see fundamental the strategic planning for adaptation measures, which are a part of the climate change mitigation plan. And we are not just talking about basic exposure, but also to sensitivity, the context facing that climate risk, and of the different stakeholders. Something that it was important to mix or to join these metrics with climate information.
estamos viendo cómo eso también es, por ejemplo,
And
uno de
we
los
see how that
fundamentales
is one of the main requirements for the access to financing, for example,
¿no?
for funds for climate, for example,
La racionalidad
to be
climática
able
de la
to rationalize
y ahí, Edgar, quizá la
or
pregunta
to understand the rationales of financing for climate change.
¿cómo
In
ves
that way, we can understand how from the region and how the efforts are going around strengthening that climate information to understand what are the needs that can allow us to align the metrics of adaptation
información científica
to
y datos
scientific information and to climate
cómo
data,
deja eso
and
algunos
how that
las
reflects in
internacionales?
conversations in international negotiations too
Sin
of
duda, pues,
climate
creo que
adaptation.
precisamente, o sea, yo creo que es
Thank
uno
you
de
for
los
that question. I believe that this is one of the most
prioritarios para la región y que creo que
prioritary that I will say for the region and
de
our
nuestros
negotiators in our countries in the international negotiations should
como una
have
prioridad
this as a priority,
dar, bueno, el informe
highlighting the report, the sixth report of
del
assessment of IPCC
el año pasado,
that was launched last year, and that highlights
en Centroamérica y Suramérica
in
hay
Central America and in South America
limitada información, data,
this
datos
limited information
y proyecciones de climáticas
and climate projection, climate forecasts that are at a low level, we can see at a local level.
en ese mismo reporte.
In that same report, they stated how that was a limiting to a limit to the report itself to assess the risks of the region, which meant that it didn't mean that we didn't have more risk in the region, it's just that we didn't have information for it. And also the IPCC report mentioned how
Limitado entendimiento.
we have a limited understanding also in Central America,
Imagino que mucho a nivel de
and I'm guessing that's quite a lot at the local level or at the national level.
a nivel de las
But basically, the understanding of communities, there's a few understanding of impacts and risks in how
decisiones
and discuss an appropriate decision making for adaptation without taking into account future risks.
el informe del IPCC
In the IPCC's report, I don't know if it was one of the observations that they laid out about the way that adaptation was taking place. And it was a really short-term type of focus,
no solo en Centroamérica, sino en el
not just in Central America, but across the world.
en el corto plazo,
Was really focused on short-term approach,
más de largo plazo.
and that doesn't incorporate the whole planning process.
Digamos, lagunas
I believe that these
resaltadas en el informe mismo,
lagoons or gaps highlight in the IPCC report for Central America and Latin America. And I think that they should or we should
prioridades de nuestros negociadores.
make them a part of our priorities for our negotiations.
El año pasado en Sharm el
Last
Sheikh,
year
bueno,
in
hubo
Sharm el Sheikh,
esta iniciativa del
we had this initiative
general
of the General Secretary for the early alert systems,
los sistemas de alerta
for to
temprana,
universalize the systems,
estar cubierta por sistemas de alerta temprana,
so everyone is covered by the early alert systems.
la
And
generación
this will help
de más datos y a los
the generation of more data, climate services in different countries where they are just starting by the least developed countries,
estados insulares,
as more countries, insular states, and we also have Guatemala and Ecuador, I believe, in this first
grupo de países en los que están tratando de
cluster of countries we're trying to implement that on. But I believe that that will aid in different efforts also that we are taking place in the meteorological organization to improve climate services and this information. But I believe that this is something that we need to encourage from our own countries with our own negotiators.
Muchas gracias, Edgar. Y quizá ahí, como mencionaba también Santiago, un área
Thank you. Just as Santiago mentioned, maybe an interesting area of work for the private
porque aparte
sector,
de toda la generación
because beyond the integration of the information and climate data, I believe that there's a high importance in the translation or the implication of this in climate data and the matchment of this climate information to potential impact or opportunities of action for adaptation. Thank you very much, everyone. We have some questions as well for our panelists from the first panel. So I'll open the mic to Pilar, for Pilar, so she can moderate that session. But thank you again to all of you.
Muchas gracias, Marta, y
Thank you very
efectivamente
much, Martha.
tanto el segundo panel como la
to the
oportunidad
second
de
panel and to the opportunity
los comentarios
to
de
ask
las
questions and hear comments from the
sinceramente
second round that were really insightful and it closes some gaps specifically for our region. And in that sense, we have the possibility of going back to Angela and Luz so we can hear a bit more of the national approach. And in that sense, I have two questions. Let me invite one and then the other after to answer, but you can intervene on some of the questions or all of the questions, whichever you like. I understand that these are really broad questions that cover quite a lot, but maybe you can give us a thought from each one. On one hand, I'm asking myself, how do we link the current framework with the current components of the goal that we have with resiliency, with vulnerability, with adaptation capacity? And in that sense, can this mean a relation with a graduality uh, process related to results? And how these countries are looking at the possibility of being gradual or to move forward, and more specifically with their own framework that would mean a transformational dynamics. And it's important also to hear you on that end. The second question also has to do with financing. At some point, some of the panelists mentioned specifically these collective quantitative goals for financing, where we see a bit of a difference in the timing of decision. And as we know, in the negotiation systems, this can carry out or can lead the countries to think that there's some conditions here that cannot be finished by the end of this year because there are still ongoing negotiations. So how countries look at their negotiation process, because maybe financing can also be included within this framework. But beyond that, what is the next step in matters of financing? If it's through goals, indicators, if it's bottom up or top to bottom, or the details of the reporting system. So how can we use current reporting systems, even if your countries are already considering or not the introduction or adaptation methodologies for next year? How can they relate to the global goals? I know that this is quite a lot, and you're completely free of only answering one, two, or three. So if you think, Angela, thank you very much, Pilar. Thank you very much for the questions. Let me start by going from bottom to top to carry on with the comments that you ask. I think that that approach is rather appropriate regarding the reporting systems. I think that for Colombia, it's really important, and for the other countries too. So these countries can introduce a report about how are we moving forward in implementation of our communications in adaptation. In the cases of the independent association for Latin American Caribbean, it's important for us the communications in adaptation because these are our main tool where we have identified our priorities and adaptation needs from here to 2030. So we hope that despite having these voluntary topics, but at the end of the day, it's an important point that we can have the Paris Agreement and with them a specific article for adaptation. And I think it's important for countries to visualize what we've done, and it would be important to include this in this biannual report of transparency. So Colombia is waiting for it, and we hope that many countries of Latin America can also unite this call out to report the actions in compliance of our MSs and our communications in adaptation. In terms of financing, and next question, here I would like to point out this is a national title. Of course, financing is important. I believe all countries in development will support financing. But one of my concerns, especially facing this topic, is that we have many financing goals and none of them has been covered. And why am I saying this because I'm not against establishing a global goal in financing for adaptation. I don't think that's bad myself, or a target to adaptation under financing of this framework. But I was asking myself, even beyond that, we have a goal of $1 billion per year under the Paris Agreement that has not been complied with so far. We have an additional goal in the Glasgow Agreement of Glasgow 26 to provide the adaptation, and we have not complied yet. And this goal of financing, we're still waiting for a component to still be financing for adaptation. So there's still a goal for financing in adaptation, or at least that's what we're looking at in the other countries. And I believe that everyone, the whole world in development. So we have around three goals of financing in adaptation: the billion, then the new quantifier goal with an adaptation component, and then establishing a framework goal that I'm not against, and that's good. But reality is that no financing goal has been complied. So my question is, beyond establishing the goal, how can we make sure that these are complied? That's a big question because it's easy to just write it down in the paper, but to comply with just getting at that. That's my question regarding financing. That's a little bit tragic, but I want to be realistic. I'm not against, I'm never against financing. But my question is, how can we comply? And the second one would be, and I think that my last question was the most technical one, um, is more leaning towards informational dynamics and how can we get all these processes united. I believe that really one of the things, the most important things, is that the framework has to give us an open space for this type of transformation and action that we need to carry out at the local and a national level. I believe that the new framework should be the path the countries need to follow so we can achieve monitoring strong systems that I believe everyone has mentioned. But additionally, I believe that this new framework should also be a trigger to measure what's adequate, what's effective of the measures that we are carrying out in adaptation. Why am I pointing this? Because this framework should also cover the world or the global needs. And that's something that I haven't heard this dialogue. That I do believe that the global balance is what's going to tell us where are we and where do we need to get to. So I believe that's really important that within this whole discussion, we can also consider the global balance and how this new goal for adaptation, with its own target and its own indicators, will contribute towards evaluation of the collective process of compliance of the Paris Agreement. Thank you, and I'm sorry for going too
Muchísimas gracias, Ángela, por
much on
tus
it.
aportes,
Thank you very much, Angela, for your input.
relevantes
Really
para
important
nuestra
input
discusión y también por hacer
for
una
our
reflexión
conversation, and
sobre
also
las
thanks
preguntas.
for
En ese
making an
sentido,
effort on answering the two questions. So in that
la
sense, I would like to give the
para
opportunity to
alguna de
Luz
ellas.
to take one of them or the approach that you would like. Please, Luz, go ahead.
Gracias, Pilar. Y bueno, sumándome
Thank you,
al
Pilar.
comentario que
And I'll
decía
just
recién,
follow
yo creo que
Angela's
una
comment.
señal
I
en el
believe
marco
that a signal
del
in the
balance
framework of
global
the process of the global
colectivo
balance of
de
collective
cumplimiento del
bargain
Acuerdo de París
and
es
the
precisamente el propósito
compliance of
de
the Paris
descentralizar.
Agreement, it can
Tenemos el
also
artículo
be in
7.14
behalf
que
of
dice
the
el objetivo global de
convention
adaptación
in
debe ser
2014
evaluado bajo
talks
un
about
proceso.
evaluation of this
Todavía
process.
no sabemos
And
cómo
so
ni
adaptation needs to be assessed or
el
evaluated on
framework
this process. So
por
we
fin a dar una
don't know
respuesta.
how this
Y la
framework
decisión
is
del
going
año
to
pasado,
give
la
us
decisión
an answer. Last
13MA4,
year's decision was
indica que
the
los órganos subsidiarios, las
EMA4
oficinas de los
that
órganos
stated
subsidiarios,
that the
los resultados del
subsidiary
programa de trabajo
organisms
para el objetivo
have
de
a
adaptación
result for
deben
the
ser
electric program
considerados
towards this
y
objective can
esto
be
debe
and
ser
needs to
considerado
be
también
considered. This
en
needs
la
to be considered
COP28,
as
¿no?
well
Entonces,
in COP
una de las
23.
señales de que
So
estamos
one of the
cumpliendo
signals that we are
y cómo lo
complying
estamos haciendo es justamente
and how are we
avanzar
doing
en
it
las
is
acciones
specifically
me
to move
sumo
forward
completamente
with this framework
al
agreement. So
comentario de Ángela de hacer y tender
just
este
to
puente de cómo, ¿no? Y creo que
understand
el
what I'm
cómo
saying, how can we do
una
it?
reflexión
And then how is
consolidando
something that we
ese
can see
conjunto de
results reflected.
políticas, ¿no? Las
With
técnicas
a
del marco
technical
del programa de
session,
trabajo de Glasgow y las
the
políticas en el
framework
marco
of the
de la
Glasgow
globalización.
Convention, in the political and the
En ese
framework of
sentido, por lo menos
negotiations.
nuestro
So in that
grupo
sense, I
a
believe,
repetir la
okay,
pregunta, voy al
just to
revés,
answer the first question,
desde
let
la
me go
primera hacia la
backwards
última.
from the first one to
Claramente entendemos
the last one. We
que el
clearly
enfoque tiene que
understand
tener
that this approach needs
gradual,
to have a
la
gradual
adopción del marco tiene que
approach,
suceder a fin
that
de
the
año
adoption of the framework
y
will happen at the end of the year,
probablemente no sea
and that likely it won't be
pero sí, como decía Ángela, darnos una orientación
the best
y
one, but it would give us some
marcarnos una
guidance.
senda y un camino
It
sobre
will
cómo
establish
hemos
a whole
avanzado
path
hacia
on
estos
how
meses
we
y
move
queremos
forward.
hacerlos
So now
así de cara al
that's what
segundo
we're
balance
planning
global,
on
¿no? Entonces,
to face in the second
gradualidad,
global balance.
sin lugar a
So
dudas,
being gradual for
es un
us
camino.
is a path,
Respecto a
it's
lo
a way,
transformacional, para
and
nosotros también
related to
es clave
transformational,
capturarlo
it's also key
a
to
través de
capture
distintos
this
aspectos del
through
framework,
different
pero
aspects of the
como
framework.
entendemos también de que
But in the way that we understand
algo
it,
bastante teórico y sobre que
this might
todavía
be
hay
something rather
muchas discusiones y
theoretical,
todavía
and
se
we
intenta
might have
entender,
go
digamos,
through a
el
lot of
enfoque
questions, and we might try to
transformacional,
understand the
quizás capturarlo de
transformational
manera
approach. Maybe we
cualitativa,
want to
quizás con
capture
estudios
it
que estén representativos
qualitatively
de
with
Centroamérica,
case
Sudamérica,
studies from
¿no?
Central
De
America,
todas las
South
regiones
America,
y que
from
haya
all
un
regions,
balance en ese sentido.
and to have a
Cómo
balance
estructurar
about
un
how
proceso
to
de
capture
desarrollo
processes
transformacional
of
a través de estos
transformational
frameworks,
adaptation
con
to this framework. If it's not
una meta o un indicador
with a
de
goal or with an
alineamiento y
indicator
dar
that
cuenta
in
de
a
cómo
way
se está
we
abordando
can
en todas las regiones,
realize how are we
particularmente en
tackling
América
this
Latina.
in all regions
Em,
of
en
Latin
relación a
America.
la segunda, coincido también
In relation
completamente
to
con
the second one,
Ángela.
I agree with Angela.
Nosotros todavía seguimos trabajando en el
We're
cómo,
still working
reflejar
on the how
lo que veo de
and
implementación
reflecting on
específicamente
the
el tema del
implementation
financiamiento
needs, which are
en el framework,
financing
pero creemos que
in the
definitivamente
framework,
es
but
uno
we
de los
believe that
componentes que deben
definitely
ser
this is one of the
reflejados.
components that should
Sabemos que hay
be
una
reflected.
distancia
And we
temporal
understand that there's a
que vamos a
temporary
ir entre el
distance
programa de trabajo
where
para
we
la
can
nueva
say some of the
meta
work
que
according to the
debería
new
de
goal.
establecerse para
But in
antes de
theory, should be
2025
established for
y
2025.
lo que nosotros esperamos
And
del
what
framework
we
es
are
que
waiting for
hay una
this
brecha
framework is
definitivamente,
that there's a
no
gap.
podemos no incluir
We
nada,
no definitely, but we
es un
cannot not
llamamiento
include
a
anything.
compromisos que ya
So we want
los
to basically ask you
Ángela
and then
estos tres
to
tipos,
encourage
digamos,
you
de
to
metas,
go after
este tipo de
commitments or
procesos,
goals.
de alguna
So for
manera
these three
tienen que
types
estar
of processes,
reflejados, ya sea con las
that in a
metas que
way
ya
need to be
tenemos en el
reflected
framework
with
y
a
a
goal
través
that
de
we have in our
indicadores
framework
en
or
cada
to
uno de los
indicators
distintos estilos de
in
política
each
de
and one of
adaptación.
the
Podría
stages.
ser, digamos, a través de
Maybe
indicadores,
so it could
podría
be
ser
through
una
indicators, it
vía.
could be a
Sabemos
way.
que no vamos a llegar. Las discusiones
We know that
de
we're
la nueva
not going to
meta,
make it with
están, digamos,
the
desfasadas respecto a las
justice for
discusiones del
this
framework,
new
pero esa es la
goal,
realidad y
which
nosotros no
is
podemos
delayed from
eludir.
the framework,
Y
the
sobre todo,
reality
a
that we cannot
partir de
elude.
estos resultados,
But we
de
want to
la
capture this
planificación de
result,
estas metas y estos indicadores, nos van a
these
permitir
indicators and goals
mostrar esa
that will
necesidad
allow us
y
to capture the
justamente
need
la necesidad de que lo que
and
se
the needs
comprometió se cumpla. Y
of what
finalmente,
was
para no
promised to
extenderme
be
más,
complied. Not to go to further into
respecto
this
a la última pregunta, los temas
related
de
to the
reporte
last
y
question,
los que estamos
reporting wise, and
considerando,
if we're
considerándolo
considering
claramente,
this
por lo menos Argentina
clearly,
está considerando
at least
presentar
Argentina is considering
el
to
BTR en
introduce in their
reporte
BPI
voluntario.
the voluntary
Estuvimos
report.
también trabajando fuerte para la
We've
revisión
also strongly
del
onto the
componente
review of the
de los
component
componentes
in
del
the
BTR y hay
voluntary
claramente
presentation
un
of the
trabajo
BPIs,
importante
and
que se
there's
tiene que hacer
really a
en
strong
articularlo en
type of work
distintos
that
instrumentos, ¿no?
took
La
place in
adaptación,
articulating
los
instruments,
BTR, otros instrumentos
adaptation,
como
BPRs, or the different instruments,
acción para el
national
mejoramiento
strategies
climático,
for
el
action
plan
for
de
climate
género, por ejemplo,
improvement,
que tiene sus
and the
proyecciones
actions that
de
your has
género.
its own
Entonces, el
plan
framework
and
de alguna
action plans
manera
for gender
y
equality. So
orientar
this
la
framework will
información
allow us to
de
guide
eso que vamos a
information
comunicar y como dije en
that
mi
we
primera
have already been
intervención,
communicating. And like I
de
said in my
alguna
first
manera nos
intervention, in
orienta
a
y hace
way,
que el reporte que
it
nosotros
guides us
hacemos
and it
sea más
makes
efectivo
that the
y la
report that we
forma de
build to be more
capturarlo
effective in the way that we
cada
capture what
reporte
each
también tenga un impacto
government
más
report to also
concreto.
cause a more concrete effect. So thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Muchísimas gracias, Luz, también por
Thank
tu
you very
respuesta,
much, Luz, for
de
your
dar respuesta a
question, for your answers,
las
and the
interrogantes.
effort to answer the
También a
three of them.
Cristina.
We also have Christina.
Tomar alguna de
I
las
don't know, Christina, if you want to take one of the questions.
Bueno, puedo abordarles también muy rápido. Creo
I
que
can just
eh,
mention them
abordado
quite quickly. Angela and Luz have mentioned
temas
already a lot of the
la
systems, and Angela, we are also in Peru.
ILAC, entonces ya de alguna manera
We are in the allied group, so in a way, Angela was mentioning or giving you some info related to the communication related to adaptation. We are, as we said before, we already have a national plan for adaptation that already communicates
acciones estratégicas, los
the
avances
strategic action, the advances, the needs
de adaptación.
in adaptation matters.
También queremos,
And we also want,
estamos elaborando para el
we're
próximo año la
making for
comunicaciones
next
de
year the fourth national communication. So this fourth national communication will represent
la
among all
forma
of us
de
the
adaptación.
way that we are going to
No
communicate
queremos tampoco
in
tener
adaptation. We don't want to have a lot
instrumentos
of
trabajando al tiempo
instruments working at the same time.
que
We want to take advantage
ya, ya está encaminado,
of what's already in progress so we
eh,
can reflect
y comunicar, ¿no? Las
and
necesidades de
communicate
adaptación. Entonces,
the
más
adaptation
que
needs.
un documento aparte,
So more
hay
than a document on the side, at least what we are starting to do is to use, in this case,
el avance en la cuarta comunicación
the
nacional
advance
militar,
in the national communication of the BTR. At this point, we are reflecting basically
¿no? Pero
the
esta
advances for
comunicación
mitigation. But this other instrument,
a- a- a-
yeah, we will
ahí vamos a reflejar
reflect
nuestra adaptación.
what our
También
adaptation
con
is.
el tema de financiamiento
And
y
also, I agree with financing. At the end of the day, what we need
tener
is
claridad, ¿no? Ese
to
financiamiento
have clarity. This is financing that will help us to implement actions and actions that are already reflected in the national adaptation plan and it's aligned to our NDCC. So
creemos también que
we
en el caso
believe that in the case of
financiamiento, ¿no? Ya
financing,
las discusiones, además ahora
the
tenemos
discussions,
el fondo de
we already
daños donde también va a
talked
haber
about losses and damages where we're going to look at
queremos
financing.
avanzar, ¿no? Para tener seguridad
So we
de
wanted to move forward to be
con los que vamos a contar para
or to understand what are the resources that we are going to have.
finalmente la gradualidad,
And finally, the graduality of things, where we, of course,
gradual, estos
need
temas
to go gradually, like I was saying at the beginning.
que es un
When we
tema
talk about vulnerabilities, they're so diverse and there's complexities. So we hope that this framework can move forward
la gradualidad
in
queremos
this
también
short
que
amount of time. The
la
graduality,
no,
we want it not to be so slow because if no, we're not going to make it to the spaces. And like Angela said,
es el balance
we want to
global,
think, what is the global balance?
cierto
It does
acelerador,
it have to do, so we hope to step on the gas so this
no retrasa.
graduality doesn't delay too much our discussions.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristina. Gracias. Y bueno, ya estamos cerrando. Valoramos muchísimo las intervenciones.
Thank you very
Nuevamente,
much. We are already at the end. We value the interventions of the speakers that will also help us to recognize that beyond the negotiation process and understand the negotiation process would enable
perder
uh,
de vista
the national plan
que esto tiene en la realidad de nuestros países
and the
americanos.
impact that this has in Latin America and in our cities.
Llevamos muchísimo tiempo en poder negociar, por
It will take a
ejemplo,
long time to negotiate certain components of financing, but then the process of implementation is a lot more complex.
justamente las oradoras
And
no
like the speaker said,
no tenemos que
that
negociar
doesn't take away from the fact that we have to negotiate, but actually we have to
estos dos
still push in
tener
towards those two elements to have clear what our problems are in that sense.
la
And
gradualidad
like Christina mentioned, we don't want duality to take us to a circumstance where we are
un grado de evidencias
delaying what cannot or what shouldn't be delayed. So
esos dos
sort of like deciding on between these two scenarios, we want to have that dynamic on why the process of adaptation is happening, but also to achieve an effective impact for our communities that are in risk, and particularly for our region. I just want to leave it at that.
agradezco nuevamente
Let me go back to Daniel. And I want to thank you for the opportunity of sharing this opportunity or share this panel in this day. Thank you.
El micrófono, Dani.
And Daniel, just still mic still off.
Pilar, muchas gracias y pues también
And I thank you very much, and from
aquellos
our
panelistas.
end also from UNEP, we would like to thank you and all the panelists, and we would like to invite all of you to follow this roadmap towards COP28. In the chat, there's a link where you can find more information, and we find each other in the next session. Thank you very much. While we continue having conversations about this important climate change.